She hit the frozen ground face first and didn't make a sound. Nathaniel Caldwell stepped over her, over his own bride, straightened his coat, and climbed back into his carriage. He didn't look back. He just rapped the ceiling twice and the driver moved on. Wheels crunching over the snow, leaving Elizabeth Whitmore in the dirt, outside a church full of witnesses who did nothing. Nobody spoke. The cold came fast after that. But someone on the ridge had stopped his horse. Someone who had every reason in the world to ride on and chose not to. If this story reaches your heart, subscribe and follow every part to the very end. Drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The snow had been falling since before dawn, and by the time William Carter rode the eastern ridge back toward his land, it had buried the old Miller Church Road under 6 inches of white silence. His horse, a dark bay named Soldier, moved slow and careful through the drifts. William wasn't thinking about much. He was thinking about the fence line on the north pasture that needed mending before the hard freeze locked the ground solid. He was thinking about the 2 hands he'd had to let go last month and whether he could afford to replace them come spring. He was not thinking about Nathaniel Caldwell. He tried. Most days not to think about Nathaniel Caldwell. Soldier stopped. William didn't pull the reins. The horse just stopped. Ears forward, breath pluming white in the cold air. And William felt it a half-second later, that particular stillness that meant something was wrong with the landscape. He rose slightly in the saddle and looked down the slope toward the abandoned church. There was a shape in the snow beside the church steps. At first he thought it was a sack of grain someone had dropped and forgotten. Then he thought it was a deer that had gone down. But Soldier wouldn't have stopped for either of those things. And William had learned over 35 years of living to trust that horse more than he trusted most men. He guided Soldier down the slope. The shape was a woman. She was on her hands and one knee, one arm braced against the bottom step of the church. And she was wearing a wedding dress, white satin, now gray with cold and mud and snow. The skirt spread out around her like a broken wing. Her hair had come down from whatever arrangement someone had put it in. Dark hair plastered against her neck and face. Her other hand was pressed flat against her chest. And even from 6 feet away, William could see she was shaking so hard her teeth would have been clicking together if she had the strength for it. He swung down from Soldier and moved toward her, and she heard him coming. Her head came up. Her eyes found his face, and he saw the exact moment she thought about running the flinch. The instinct and the exact moment her body told her it was not going to cooperate. "Easy," he said. "I'm not going to hurt you." She stared at him. Her lips were the color of bruised plums. Her eyes were brown and very clear and very angry, which struck him as almost remarkable given the circumstances. Most people near frozen to death had a blank look. She did not look blank at all. She looked furious. "I don't need help," she said. Her voice came out in pieces. She could barely get the words formed, her jaw barely cooperating. "You're about half dead in the snow," William said. "And it's going to get colder." "I'm fine, ma'am." He stopped 2 feet from her and crouched down so he wasn't looking down at her. So they were close to level. "You're not fine. You're nowhere close to fine." She looked at him for a long moment. He could see her deciding something, calculating. Then a fresh wave of shivering hit her so hard she nearly went down off that one knee. And whatever pride she'd been holding onto cracked just slightly at the edges. "I can stand," she said. "I just need a moment, all right." He waited. He didn't reach for her. He waited while she gathered herself and pressed harder against the step and tried to push herself up. And he watched her make it halfway, and then her legs simply gave out, and she went down hard onto both knees in the snow. She made no sound. That was what got him. She went down and she pressed her lips together, and she made no sound at all. And something in his chest moved that hadn't moved in a long time. He stepped forward and got an arm under her before she could argue. "I've got you," he said. "Don't. I've got you." She was lighter than she should have been. He got her up. one arm behind her back, one under her knees. And she was rigid in his arms for 3 full seconds, every muscle locked, refusing, and then the cold one and the shaking took over, and she stopped fighting him, because she simply didn't have anything left to fight with. He got her to soldier. Getting her up into the saddle was awkward. She couldn't grip properly, and he had to mostly lift her and arrange her. And she held the saddle horn with both hands and didn't look at him. He swung up behind her and pulled her back against his chest and felt how cold she truly was through every layer between them. "What's your name?" he asked. She didn't answer. "All right," he said. "You don't have to tell me." He turned soldier back up the slope toward the ridge road and his land. And they rode in silence for almost a full minute before she said, very quietly, "Elizabeth." "William Carter," he said. "My farm is about 2 miles north. We'll get you warm." She said nothing. He said nothing. And it wasn't until they crested the ridge and Soldier picked up his pace toward home that William looked back once at the abandoned church, at the wagon tracks in the snow leading away from it one set, heading south, heading toward Harlan town, and something cold moved through him that had nothing to do with the temperature. He knew those wagon tracks. He knew the particular width of that wheelbase. He knew the horse that made those hoof prints, a big gray thoroughbred that Nathaniel Caldwell had paid $300 for last spring and made sure everyone in the county knew about it. William stared at those tracks for a long moment. Then he looked down at the woman in his arms, at the mud-soaked satin of her wedding dress, at her hands still locked around Soldier's saddle horn, at the dark bruise forming along her jaw that he hadn't noticed before, that he noticed now, and he turned his face forward and rode home and did not say a word. Margaret, his housekeeper, met them at the door. She was a broad woman in her 50s who had worked for William for 11 years and had never once in 11 years lost her composure over anything he brought through that door. She lost it slightly now. "Lord above," she said. "Get blankets," William said. "Hot water. Whatever you've got on the stove. She's alive." "Get the blankets." He carried Elizabeth inside. She had stopped shaking quite so violently. The cold had gone from active assault to a kind of exhausted numbness, which he knew was not actually better. He set her down in the chair closest to the fireplace, which Margaret had already gotten blazing by the time he turned around. And he crouched in front of her again. "Elizabeth." He kept his voice even. "Look at me." Her eyes came to his, still clear, still angry, underneath the exhaustion. "You're going to be all right," he said. "Margaret is going to help you get out of these wet clothes and get you warm. Can you understand me?" "I understand you perfectly," she said. Her voice was still broken up, still coming in halves, but the sharpness in it was undimmed. "I'm not an invalid, no. Ma'am, you're just half frozen. There's a difference." "There is," he agreed. Margaret came back with blankets and shooed him toward the door, with a look that brooked no argument. And William went out and stood in the hallway and listened to the fire crackling and the low murmur of Margaret's voice and the eventual, barely audible voice of Elizabeth answering her, and he pressed the heels of his hands against his eyes. Nathaniel Caldwell. He hadn't said her last name yet. She hadn't offered it, but he knew it. The moment he saw those wagon tracks, the moment he counted back, Caldwell's engagement had been announced 3 months ago. Elizabeth Whitmore of the Whitmore family over in Clay County. He'd heard the name at the trading post, heard men talking about it, the way men talked about business arrangements dressed up as romance. The Whitmores were in debt. Caldwell was looking for land access on the eastern route. It had never been about anything else, and now she was in his house, in his chair, in a ruined wedding dress, with a bruise on her jaw. William walked back through the house to the kitchen and stood at the window that looked out over the north pasture, where the fence line still needed mending, where everything was blanketed and silent and white. And he stood there for a long time, not thinking about much of anything at all. She slept for 4 hours. He knew because he checked twice quietly from the doorway just to be certain she was breathing. just to be certain the color was coming back. Margaret reported that she'd eaten half a bowl of soup before she went under, and that she hadn't cried once, and that she'd said thank you in a voice that made it clear she found gratitude almost physically painful. When she woke, it was past dark, and William was at the kitchen table going over the ledger from last season's harvest when he heard her footsteps. She appeared in the doorway in one of Margaret's spare dresses, plain brown wool, too wide in the shoulders and too short in the hem, and her dark hair was clean and loose around her face, and she looked like a completely different person than the woman he'd pulled out of the snow. Not better, exactly, just visible, real. She looked at him, looking at her. "I need to know," she said, "whether you intend to send word to Nathaniel Caldwell about where I am." "No," William said. She waited, as though she expected conditions to follow. "That's all," he said. "No. I don't intend to send word to Caldwell." She came further in the kitchen, across the table from him, and sat down like she belonged there. Like she'd made a decision to not be a guest in this space. And he found himself respecting that before he'd consciously chosen to. She folded her hands on the table and looked at him directly. "You know who I am," she said. It was not a question. "Elizabeth Whitmore," he said. "Supposed to be Elizabeth Caldwell as of this morning. And you know who he is to you, Nathaniel Caldwell," William said. "Took half my family's land in a debt scheme 15 years ago. Put my father in an early grave. Yeah, I know who he is," she nodded slowly. "Then I need to understand why you brought me here. Because you were half dead in the snow. And if I hadn't been?" He looked at her for a moment. It was a fair question. He gave it the honesty it deserved. "I don't know," he said. She seemed to find that acceptable. She unfolded her hands and looked down at them, and he saw for the first time that her knuckles were scraped raw. She'd fallen. He realized, probably more than once before he'd found her. "He left you," William said. Not a question either. "He found out this morning," she said, "that my father's debts were larger than he'd been told. Larger than my father had admitted to me, even. There's a second creditor. One my father hid." Her voice was very flat and very controlled. Nathaniel decided the Eastern land route wasn't worth the full burden of what he'd be taking on. He made that calculation at the church, in front of the minister. In front of 40 people. William was quiet for a moment. "He drove away," she said. "Left me standing at the altar. When I went outside, I don't know why I went outside. I think I just needed air. A boy from the church stables had already taken my family's buggy around back. There was no one left to drive me. The snow was already heavy." She stopped. "I walked." "How far?" "About a mile and a half before my legs stopped cooperating." William looked at her scraped knuckles. Looked at the bruise along her jaw. She'd gone down face first at some point. He realized. At some point in that mile and a half, she'd gone face first into the frozen ground and gotten back up and kept walking. "Your family," he said. "My father will be dealing with his creditors. My sisters are young. There's no one to go back to." "Mr. Carter, even if I wanted to," she met his eyes. "I do not intend to be a burden on your household. I will find a position in Harlantown as soon as the weather permits." "As what?" "I can keep accounts. I ran my father's books for 6 years. I can teach. I have the education for it. I'll find something." "It's January," William said. "And you don't have anyone in Harlan who'll take your side after what happened today." She flinched. Barely, just a small movement at the corner of her mouth, but he caught it. "I'm aware of how the county will see this," she said. "They'll say you did something to drive him off." "Yes." "They'll say there was something wrong with you that he found out." "Yes." "Mr. Carter, I am aware, and you still want to walk into Harlantown and find work." "What I want," she said quietly. "And what I intend to do are going to be the same thing. That's all I have left. My intentions." He looked at her for a long moment. The fire was burning well. Margaret had gone to bed. Outside, the snow was still coming down, and the north pasture fence still needed mending. And Nathaniel Caldwell was somewhere south of here in his warm house with his thoroughbred horse, thinking he'd gotten away clean. "Stay," William said. She looked at him sharply. Not. He stopped. Chose words carefully. Not as a charity case, I need someone who can keep books. Margaret does everything else, but the accounts for the farm I've been managing them myself, and I'm not good at it. I need someone who can do it properly. You're offering me work, she said slowly. I'm offering you work. You stay here, you help with the accounts. You get a room and meals. And when spring comes, if you want to move on to Harlan, you move on with money in your pocket and time behind you that the county might have forgot what they think they know. She looked at him for a long time. Why, she said. He thought about the honest answer. He thought about Nathaniel Caldwell's wagon tracks in the snow. He thought about his father's face the day they'd had to sign over the east acreage. The way something in that face had never fully recovered. Because Caldwell did the same thing to my family that he did to yours, William said. And right now you're the most direct inconvenience to him that exists in Harlan County. And I find I'm not opposed to that. A long silence. That is an extremely unromantic reason to offer someone shelter, Elizabeth said. I'm not a romantic man. I can see that. She was quiet another moment. Then I would need it understood, from the beginning, that I am not here on sufferance. I work, I contribute. I am not a guest you're managing out of pity.
Agreed.
And if I find a better arrangement in the spring,
You take it.
no argument from me. She looked at the table, looked at her hands. Then she looked up at him, and something in her face had settled into a new position. Something that was not quite trust and not quite relief, but was made of the same materials as both. All right, Mr. Carter, she said. All right, the county found out within 3 days. William had expected it to take a week, but he'd underestimated the speed of a January with nothing to do and a scandal to discuss. The first indication was when Jacob Hale from the neighboring farm rode over on a Tuesday morning with what he was a question about feed prices and spent 20 minutes working around to whether it was true that William was harboring the Whitmore girl. She's working for me, William said, keeping the farm accounts. Jacob stopped. She's living here? She has a room, she works, that's the whole story, William. Jacob looked pained. People are going to talk. People already are. I haven't found that it improves things to care about it. Nathaniel Caldwell, Jacob said. And then stopped, like the name itself was a kind of argument. What about him? He's not going to like it. No, William said. I expect he won't. Jacob left looking unsatisfied. Which meant he'd carry the full story plus his own editorializing back to whoever he talked to next. And that was fine. William had made his position clear. The position was, he didn't care. Elizabeth found out about the gossip on Friday when she rode with Margaret into town for supplies. He hadn't told her not to go. He hadn't told her to go either. She'd asked Margaret about it matter-of-factly, and Margaret had said she was going Friday, and Elizabeth had said she'd come along. And that had been that. She came back quiet. She helped Margaret put away the supplies. And then she came to the study where William was going over the fencing costs, and she stood in the doorway. They stare, she said. Yes, he said. The woman at the dry goods counter wouldn't speak to me directly. She spoke to Margaret and looked at me like I was something that had gotten in through a crack. Mrs. Alderman, he said. She's like that. 2 men outside the trading post watched me walk past, and one of them said something to the other. I didn't hear what, Elizabeth. She looked at him. You knew this would happen, he said. You said so yourself. Knowing and experiencing are different things, she said. Yes, they are. She was quiet. Then she straightened slightly, he could see it. The deliberate correction of her posture, the squaring away of something internal. I'm not going to hide, she said. I didn't ask you to. I want that to be clear. Whatever they say about me, whatever they decide I am, I'm not going to adjust myself to make them comfortable. Good, William said. She looked at him, slightly surprised, like she'd expected argument. Good, she said. I've spent 15 years in this county trying to manage what people think of the Carter name after what Caldwell did to my father. It doesn't work. You manage yourself. You do your work. You let the rest of it go where it's going to go. She considered this. Is that advice or consolation? Both, probably. She almost smiled. It wasn't quite a smile, it was more like the infrastructure of one. The shape of it without the warmth, but it was there. The accounts, she said. You left the feed cost column wrong again. I know. The addition is off by $11. I know that too. If you knew. Why didn't you? Because I knew you'd find it, he said. That's why you're here. She looked at him for a moment. And then she came into the study and sat down across from him and pulled the ledger toward her. And she did not smile, but the almost smile stayed in place. And William looked back at the fencing costs and said nothing. He found her in the barn on Sunday. He hadn't gone looking for her, he'd gone to check on Soldier's left foreleg, which had been slightly tender since the Ridge Road ride. And he'd opened the barn door, and there she was, sitting on a hay bale with her back against the wall. And she had a letter in her hands. She looked up when he came in. And she didn't hide the letter, but she folded it in a way that was clear she wasn't offering it to him either. My father, she said. Margaret brought it from town. He checked on Soldier's leg and said nothing. He wants me to come home, she said. He says he's working on a new arrangement. He says there's a man in Lexington, a merchant who might be interested. He says she stopped. He says he's sorry. Are you going to write back? William asked. I don't know what I'd say. You could say no, I could. She looked at the folded letter. He's my father. He put you in a dress and handed you to Nathaniel Caldwell to clear his debts. The words came out harder than he'd intended. She looked up at him sharply. I know what he did, she said. Then still my father. Her voice was not angry. Just tired. You can know what someone did, and still have a feeling about them that doesn't square with what they did. Can't you? He thought about his own father, about the shame in that man's face in his last years. The way the loss of the East acreage had eaten something fundamental out of him. William had been angry at his father for years for the bad investments, for the trust he'd placed in Caldwell, for the weakness of it. And he'd still sat by that man's bed at the end and held his hand. Yes, he said quietly, I reckon you can. She folded the letter smaller and put it in her pocket. I'm not going back, she said. Whatever he says. I'm not going back to be arranged into someone else's life. All right, but I'm not ready to. She stopped. It's complicated. Most things worth anything are. She looked at him. He was looking at Soldier's leg, pressing along the tendon. Not at her, Mr. Carter, she said. William, he said. If you're going to be here until spring, you might as well use my name. A pause. William, she said, like she was trying it out, like it fit differently than she expected. Leg looks better, he said, releasing Soldier's hoof. He'll be fine in a day or two. He left her there on the hay bale, with the folded letter in her pocket and the lamp burning warm in the barn. And he went back to the house, and he stood in the kitchen for a moment in the dark before he lit the lamp. And he thought about how much he hated Nathaniel Caldwell, and how the shape of that hatred had been so clear and so fixed for 15 years, and how lately, just in the last week, something around the edges of it had shifted, like ice in a river when the temperature finally breaks. He didn't know what to do with that. He lit the lamp and put water on for coffee and went back to the ledger. And outside the snow had finally stopped falling, and the world was very white and very still and full of things that hadn't been decided yet. The Monday after Elizabeth Whitmore decided to stay, William Carter found her at his kitchen table at 5 a.m, with every ledger he owned spread open in front of her and a look on her face that said she'd been there for at least 2 hours already. He stopped in the doorway. You sleep? Some, she said. Without looking up. Your grain supplier has been overcharging you for 3 seasons. Small amounts. Not enough to notice season by season. Enough to matter when you add it up. How much? $63 over 2 years. She turned the ledger toward him and pointed to a column. He rounds up on every partial bushel, consistently. Which means it's not a mistake. William looked at the numbers. Then he looked at her. You found that in one night. I found that in about 40 minutes, she said. The rest of the time I've been looking at your cattle records, which are a separate disaster." He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. "How bad? Not disastrous. Just inefficient. You're selling too early in the season and buying feed at peak prices. If you shifted both by 6 weeks, you'd clear an extra 12% on the same inventory." He was quiet for a moment. "My father managed these books," he said. "Then I managed them. I know. I can tell where his entries end and yours begin." She said it without cruelty. "Just as a fact. He was better at it than you are. He was better at most things than I am." She looked up at him then. For the first time since he'd walked in, something in his voice had landed differently than he'd intended. And she caught it, the way she seemed to catch everything quickly, quietly, and without making a production of it. "The grain supplier," she said, returning to safer ground. "Do you want to address it directly, or adjust your orders going forward?" "I'll talk to him directly. He'll deny it." "I know. But I'll have the numbers with me when I do, and he'll know I know, and it won't happen again." He paused. "That work for you?" She tilted her head slightly, like the question surprised her. "It's your farm. You're the one who found it, yes. And I work for you, so it's still your decision." But something in her expression had shifted small. Barely there, like the fact that he'd asked had registered somewhere. She went back to the ledger. He got up and started the coffee. And they stayed in that kitchen in the early dark, not talking much, and it was one of the most comfortable silences William Carter had experienced in years, which bothered him slightly, because he hadn't expected it. He hadn't expected any of this. The trouble started, properly speaking, on a Wednesday. Margaret came back from town, with supplies and a tight look around her mouth that William had learned over 11 years meant she was holding something back until she judged the time right. He waited. By dinner she hadn't said it. By the time he was banking the fire for the night, he'd had enough. "Just say it," he said. Margaret folded her hands. "Caldwell was at the trading post today." The name dropped into the room like a stone into still water. "He was asking questions," Margaret continued. "Casual. Friendly. You know what kind of questions. About Elizabeth. About whether she was truly here, or whether people had the story wrong." Margaret paused. "And about whether you'd lost your mind allowing it." William said nothing. Thomas Greer told him straight. Said yes, Elizabeth Whitmore was working at the Carter farm, keeping accounts, and that you'd hired her fair and proper. Margaret's jaw tightened. Caldwell laughed. What kind of laughed? The kind that means he's not worried. The kind that means he thinks this is amusing. She looked at William steadily. He said, and I'm giving you his words exact, he said. "William Carter taking in my leavings. That's about what I'd expect from a man who couldn't hold on to his own land." The fire popped. William's hands were very still at his sides. "He said that in the trading post," he said. "In front of people. In front of 7 people, including Reverend Miles." Another long silence. William turned back to the fire and looked at it for a moment. And then he said very quietly, "Does Elizabeth know?" "Not from me. Keep it that way for now." Margaret looked like she wanted to say something else. She didn't. She went to bed and William stayed by the fire. And he thought about Nathaniel Caldwell's laugh. He could hear it perfectly. He'd heard it before, that particular sound, that meant a man believed himself untouchable, and he thought about what Elizabeth had said in the barn. About knowing what someone did, and still having a feeling about them that didn't square. He didn't have that problem with Caldwell. Every feeling he had about Nathaniel Caldwell squared perfectly. Elizabeth found out anyway. Not from Margaret and not from William. She found out the way anyone finds out things in a small county in January, from the air itself. From the way people looked at her when she and William rode into Harlan together on Friday to deal with the grain supplier. She found out from the grain supplier himself. His name was Bert Howell. And he was a stout man with small eyes who smiled too much. And he smiled that way when William and Elizabeth walked into his store. And he said, "Mr. Carter, always a pleasure." And then he looked at Elizabeth, and the smile went a specific kind of careful, and he said, "Miss Whitmore," and she heard, in that pause before her name, everything she needed to know about what was being said about her in this town. She smiled back, wide and steady and without warmth. "It's been a while since I've gone over your billing records with Mr. Carter," she said. "I have some questions about the grant tallies from the last 2 seasons." Howell's smile faltered. $63, she said pleasantly, setting the ledger page on his counter. "In rounding errors. All in your favor, all consistent. I've marked the specific entries. The store was not empty. 3 other men were in it, and they were very quiet now." And Howell was looking at the ledger page, and the color was climbing up his neck. "Now, I'm sure it was an honest mistake," Elizabeth continued, in a voice that made clear she was sure of no such thing. "But Mr. Carter will need the amount credited to his next order, and we'll be adjusting how partial bushels are recorded going forward. Is that something you can manage?" A long moment. "Yes," Howell said, flat and bitten off. "Wonderful." She picked up the ledger page and tucked it back under her arm. "We appreciate your business, Mr. Howell. We really do." She turned and walked back out. And William followed her, and they got 20 feet from the door before he said, "You enjoyed that?" "Enormously," she said. He almost laughed. He caught it before it got all the way out, but she heard it anyway. And she glanced at him sideways, and there was something bright in her face for just a second before the wind cut at them, and they both pulled their coats tighter. "He'll complain," William said. "Let him. He has $63 of your money and knows I can prove it. He won't make noise. You're good at this. I've been managing difficult men since I was 16, she said. My father's creditors, the men who thought a woman couldn't read a contract." She paused. "Nathaniel Caldwell," briefly, before I understood what he was. It was the first time she'd said his name directly to William. He registered it. "How long did it take you?" he asked. "To understand what he was." She was quiet for a moment. "Longer than it should have. He was very charming." And I wanted she stopped. Started again. I wanted to believe the arrangement could become something real. "That seems foolish now." "It's not foolish, it was naive." "There's a difference," he said. "Naive means you expected better from people. That's not the same as being foolish." She looked at him again. That sideways look. "That's a surprisingly generous interpretation." Mr. Carter William. William, the slight correction of herself. "Are you speaking from experience?" He thought about that for a moment. "My father trusted Caldwell because he wanted to believe a man with that kind of confidence and charm must know something he didn't. Must have a plan worth following." He was quiet. "My father was a smart man. Not naive. Just willing to believe in something." "What happened?" "Caldwell proposed a joint investment. Eastern land development, cutting new trade routes. My father put in everything we had that wasn't entailed to the farm. Caldwell took the capital, restructured the notes, and when the deal went bad, and it went bad because he made sure it went bad, my father was holding paper that was worth nothing, and Caldwell was holding the deed to our eastern acreage." He paused. "Legal. Every bit of it legal. Caldwell's very good at legal." Elizabeth was quiet for a moment. "How old were you?" 20. "Old enough to understand what happened. Not old enough to do anything about it. Your father died 4 years later. Wasn't one thing that killed him. Was everything together." William's voice was even. He'd had 15 years to make it even. The shame of it more than anything. He'd lost his father's land. He couldn't get past that. She didn't say she was sorry. He appreciated that. People who said they were sorry for things they had no part in always felt like they were doing it for themselves more than for the person they were saying it to. What she said was he must have fought it. He tried. Lawyers in Lexington, one in Louisville. Nobody wanted to go up against Caldwell's people. William glanced at her. The documentation was too clean. That's what they all said. The documentation is too clean, Mr. Carter. There's nothing here to challenge. Elizabeth was quiet for a long moment. He does that, she said softly. makes everything clean on paper. My father's debt arrangement with him, I read every word of it before my father signed. I thought I understood it. She paused. I didn't see what I didn't know to look for. What did you miss? A clause about secondary creditors. Buried in language about property transfer timelines. If a secondary creditor emerged after signing, Caldwell had the right to dissolve the arrangement immediately, with no obligation to the Whitmore estate. Her mouth was tight. My father had a second creditor. Caldwell knew about it before he ever proposed. He waited. William stopped walking. She stopped too, and turned to look at him. He knew about the second creditor before he proposed to you, William said slowly. Yes, which means the whole arrangement was designed to fail. He was going to walk away regardless. Yes, he wanted something else, William said. Not the land access. Something else that he got in the process of setting up the arrangement. Elizabeth stared at him. And then he watched the color leave her face as something clicked into place for her, something she hadn't fully assembled before now. The trade route survey, she said. My father let Caldwell's men survey the eastern property as part of the due diligence. All of it, the full eastern corridor. Her voice had gone very quiet. We thought it was standard, we thought. He didn't need to buy the land, William said. He just needed the survey. He needed to know what was there. The creek route, Elizabeth said. Almost to herself. There's a creek route through the eastern Whitmore land that connects to the Miller tributary. If you know where it runs, you can route freight without using the Harlan Road at all. Avoid the county toll entirely. She looked at William. He got the survey for free, and then he walked away. The wind moved between them. He did the end thing to us, William said. The eastern acreage he took, we always thought it was about the acreage. But there's a natural ford across the creek on that property. Only ford for 12 miles in either direction. He paused. He wasn't building a trade route. He was buying control of the only two passages through this part of the county. They stood there in the cold outside the spring post in Harlan, Kentucky in January of 1817, and looked at each other, and understood simultaneously that the thing they'd each thought was a separate wound was the same wound. Caldwell hadn't been making disconnected moves. He'd been building something. Piece by piece, deal by deal, ruin by ruin. He's not done, Elizabeth said. No, William said. He's not. That night, Elizabeth sat at the kitchen table with both sets of records, William's and her memory of her father's, and she worked until well past midnight reconstructing what she could. William sat across from her and didn't pretend to do anything else. He watched her work and answered questions when she had them, and brought coffee when the pot ran low. At midnight, she sat back and pressed her fingers against her eyes. There are 3 other families, she said. I can see it in the pattern. The Greer land on the North Road, the Alderman property by the mill, and the Tanner holdings east of the ridge. She looked at him. Caldwell has had dealings with all 3 in the last 4 years. Small dealings. Friendly ones. Jacob Greer told me last year Caldwell had approached him about a storage arrangement, William said slowly. Jacob thought it was a good deal. Turned it down eventually because his wife didn't like Caldwell. His wife was right. His wife usually is. William looked at the papers. If he controls the ford on my property, the creek route through your father's land, and gets any kind of foothold on the North Road, and he controls how goods move through this entire part of the county, Elizabeth finished. Every farmer, every merchant, every family that needs to trade, they route through infrastructure he owns. He sets the terms, he sets the prices. The silence in the kitchen was very loud. We need to stop him, William said. Yes, Elizabeth said. We do. The we landed in the room and neither of them commented on it. But it was there. The second week of February brought a thaw, and with it, trouble in a form William hadn't anticipated. He was mending the north fence line when he saw the rider coming from the Harlan direction, not Jacob Hale. Not anyone from the neighboring farms. A man he didn't recognize. Well dressed for the weather, on a horse that cost money. The man rode up and stopped at a respectful distance and called out, "Is this the Carter property?" "It is," William said. "I'm looking for Miss Whitmore, Elizabeth Whitmore." William set down his fencing tool. "Who's asking?" "My name is Daniel Whitmore." A pause. "I'm her brother." Elizabeth met Daniel in the front room. William stayed in the hall, not listening, exactly present. She hadn't asked him to stay, but she hadn't told him to go. And given the way her shoulders had tightened when he told her who had arrived, he made the decision to be findable without being intrusive. The conversation started low and got loud faster than he expected. "Father needs you home." Daniel's voice, young stranger, trying to carry authority it hadn't quite grown into. "This is embarrassing the family. Every day you stay here, it gets worse." "I have a position," Elizabeth said. "I have work. You're living in a single man's house. I am employed in a single man's household, along with his housekeeper, who has been here for 11 years and is here every day. People don't see it that way. Then people are wrong." "Elizabeth." A shift in his tone, younger now. Less authority, more actual brother. "Father is in a bad way. The creditors are circling and he can't." "I know what father can't do," she said. "I know it better than you do, Daniel. I read every document he signed for the last 6 years. I kept his books. I know what and cannot manage." Her voice was not unkind, but it was immovable. "That doesn't mean the answer is me going home to be arranged into another solution. He's talking to a man in Lecton."
"No, just meet him."
"Elizabeth," I said no. Quiet. Final. The kind of no that doesn't leave room for the next question. "I love father. I will help him in every way I can that doesn't require me to trade myself for his debts again. I will write to him. I will send money when I have it. But I am not coming home to be a bargaining piece. And that is the last time I will say it." A long silence. Then Daniel, quieter. "Are you happy here?" The question clearly surprised her. William heard it in the small pause before she answered. "I am useful here," she said. "I am treated with respect. I can think clearly and work properly, and I don't spend my days afraid of what's coming next." Another pause. "That's more than I've had in a long time, Daniel." Her brother was quiet for a moment. "He really is a good man?" "Carter?" William stayed very still in the hallway. "He is," Elizabeth said. "He is a good man." It was said simply and directly. The way she said everything, without decoration, and it hit William somewhere in the chest, with a force that was entirely out of proportion to the words. He walked quietly back to the kitchen before Daniel came out. Daniel Whitmore stayed for supper. Margaret fed him, and he was polite and uncomfortable, and young William put him at maybe 22, and he looked at his sister across the table with a mix of guilt and admiration that he was too young to fully conceal. Before he left, he pulled William aside by the door. "You know Caldwell's going to move on this," Daniel said. "Low urgent. He's been telling people this whole situation is a humiliation to him. That you took his..." He stopped. Started again. "He doesn't like it. He's the kind of man who doesn't leave things alone when they bother him." "I know what kind of man he is," William said. "He has lawyers. He has money and lawyers and people who owe him favors across 3 counties. Daniel looked at him. "I'm not saying this to scare you. I'm saying it because my sister is here and I need to know she's safe," William said. "I'll see to it." Daniel looked at him for a long moment, the measuring look. Uncertain, trying to decide what to believe. "She said you were a good man," Daniel said. "She's a good judge of things." "Yeah." A long pause. "She really is." He pulled his coat tighter. "Watch out for Caldwell's man. Rourke. That's who he sends when he doesn't want to go himself. Big man, red beard. If you see him around your property, it means Caldwell's already made a decision about something." William filed that away. Daniel rode south in the last light, and William stood at the door watching him go. And when he turned back into the house, Elizabeth was in the kitchen doorway watching him. "What did he say to you?" she asked. "He asked me to look after you." I know you don't," William said. "I told him you were safe. That's all." She looked at him for a moment. And Caldwell? He mentioned Caldwell. He said Caldwell's bothered by the situation. He's been bothered since the day you brought me here, she said. He doesn't like things that don't go the way he planned them. Good. It's not good. William, a bothered Caldwell is a dangerous one. An unbothered Caldwell is more dangerous, he said. At least when he's reacting, he's not planning. She thought about that. Then Rourke, she said. He looked at her. You know him? Caldwell brought him to 2 of the meetings with my father. Never introduced him. Never explained why he was there. He just stood at the back of the room and watched. She paused. The way a man watches when he's trying to learn the layout of a place. The pieces moved in William's mind. He was surveying your father's property, William said. In those meetings, while Caldwell kept my father's attention at the table, her voice had gone flat. My father thought it was strange that Caldwell kept asking to meet at the house instead of in town. He thought it was a courtesy, a sign of respect. It was access, William said. He wanted access to the property. He wanted Rourke to have access. She pressed her hands flat against the kitchen table. That man was inside our home. He ate at our table twice. And he was drawing maps. William looked at her hands on the table pressed flat. Controlled, the way she controlled everything when she was angry. Not shaking, just still and utterly furious. We're going to stop him, William said. We don't have enough yet. Her voice was precise. We know what he's doing, but we can't prove it. Not in any way that would hold up against his lawyers. Then we get proof how. The Greer family. The Aldermans. The Tanners. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. If he's run the same kind of arrangement with them that he ran with my family and yours, the pattern in the paperwork will show it. And if we get 3 families showing the same pattern with the same man at the center, that's fraud, she said. If we can document it systematically, that's what I'm thinking. She was quiet for a moment. Then she looked up at him, and something in her face was different, sharper. More focused, lit up in a way that had nothing to do with hope and everything to do with purpose. Jacob Greer's wife doesn't like Caldwell, she said. She doesn't. Then she'll talk to me. Elizabeth stood up. I'll need paper and ink. In the morning, William said. She looked at him. It's 10 o'clock at night, he said. It'll still be fraud in the morning. A pause. And then not the almost smile. Not the infrastructure of one. An actual smile, brief and real and sudden. Like something that had slipped out before she could decide about it. In the morning, she agreed. She took her lamp and went to bed. And William sat at the kitchen table alone, and outside the February thaw was dripping from the eaves. And somewhere south of here, Nathaniel Caldwell was deciding what to do about a situation he hadn't planned for. And William Carter found that for the first time in 15 years, the thought of that man didn't fill him with cold and purposeless fury. It filled him with something sharper, something that had a direction. He banked the fire and went to bed, and he slept better than he had in months. And in the morning there was work to do. The Greer farm was 3 miles north. And Elizabeth rode there alone on a Tuesday morning while William went to talk to the Tanner family on the East Road. She hadn't asked permission. She'd said, I'm going to see Sarah Greer today, and William had said, take the bay, she's steadier on ice, and that had been the whole conversation. She appreciated that about him more than she'd expected to, the way he didn't manage her. Didn't add conditions or cautions or the particular kind of concerned look that men gave women when they were about to do something that required actual intelligence. Sarah Greer met her at the door before she'd even dismounted. I was wondering when you'd come, Sarah said. Elizabeth tied the horse and climbed the porch steps. You knew I was coming? I knew somebody would eventually. Sarah held the door open. Come in. I've had coffee on since breakfast. Sarah Greer was a compact, straight-backed woman in her 40s with sharp eyes and the permanently wind-burned complexion of someone who spent as much time outdoors as inside. She'd been born a Hendricks, which in Harlan County meant she came from people who said what they thought and didn't apologize for it afterward. She poured coffee without asking and put the cups on the table and sat down across from Elizabeth and said, "What do you need?" "Your husband's agreement with Caldwell," Elizabeth said. "The storage arrangement he was offered last year. The one Jacob turned down, yes." "Do you still have the paperwork?" Sarah looked at her steadily for a moment. "Why?" "Because I believe Caldwell has been running the same scheme across multiple families in this county. Your family, mine, William Carter's, possibly the Aldermans and the Tanners. If the documentation patterns match across all of us, it establishes fraud that his lawyers can't explain away." Sarah was quiet. "He came after my family differently than he came after yours," Elizabeth continued. "He adjusts the approach to fit the target. But the underlying structure, the way the contract is written, where the liability gets shifted, how the exit clause is buried, I think that's consistent. That's what I need to see." Sarah stood up, went to the back room, and came back 2 minutes later with a document folded in thirds. She put it on the table. "I made Jacob keep it," she said. "He wanted to throw it in the fire when he turned Caldwell down. Said there was no point in keeping paper from a deal that didn't happen. I told him we were keeping it." She sat back down. "I didn't know why exactly. I just knew that man's name shouldn't be on a piece of paper we didn't have a copy of." Elizabeth unfolded it and started reading. She found the clause in 4 minutes. Different language than in her father's contract. Different position in the document, but the same mechanism, a transfer of liability that looked, on a first reading, like standard protective language, and revealed itself on a closer reading as a trapdoor. "There," she said, and turned the document so Sarah could see where her finger was pointing. "This paragraph, what does it look like to you?" Sarah read it. "Looks like it's protecting Jacob from being held responsible if the storage goods are damaged. That's what it looks like. What it actually does is give Caldwell the right to claim damages against any other agreements Jacob has in place if the storage arrangement dissolves under specific conditions. Conditions that Caldwell controls." She looked up. "If Jacob had signed this and then needed to sell part of his land for any reason, harvest failure, medical costs, anything, Caldwell could have stepped in and claimed a portion of the proceeds as damages from the dissolved storage deal." Sarah stared at the paragraph. "He would have owned a piece of whatever Jacob sold," Sarah said slowly, "without ever appearing on the deed, without ever being part of the original sale." Elizabeth folded the document carefully. "He's not buying land, he's buying claims against land. When people are in trouble, real trouble, the kind where they have to sell, he's first in line, and nobody knew to expect him." The kitchen was very quiet. That son of a— Sarah stopped, pressed her lips together. "Then, what do you need from me?" "A signed statement describing when Caldwell approached Jacob, what he represented the deal to be, and confirming the document is authentic. And Jacob's signature on the same." "Jacob's going to have trouble with this," Sarah said. "Not because he doesn't believe you. Because he's going to want to ride into Harlan and do something about it that involves his fists. And I'm going to have to talk him out of that. Tell him that if he does that, Caldwell wins," Elizabeth said. "Tell him the only way to beat this man is on paper. In a courtroom, where his money and his charm don't matter and the only thing that counts is what the documents say." Sarah looked at her for a long moment. "You really think you can take him down?" Sarah said. "It wasn't quite a question. I think we can," Elizabeth said. "If we do this right." She got back to the Carter farm in the early afternoon and found William already returned, sitting at the kitchen table with a look on his face that she'd learned meant he was working through something difficult. "The Tanners?" she asked. "Signed and sealed. Robert Tanner's been sitting on an agreement with Caldwell for 2 years that he didn't understand. His wife understood it fine. She just didn't know what to do about it." He looked up. "They're in. What about Greer?" "Sarah will bring Jacob round by tomorrow. We'll have their statement by end of week." She sat down and spread the Greer document on the table beside what William had brought back from the Tanners. She put her own family's paperwork next to both. They looked at the 3 documents side by side. The pattern was unmistakable. Different deals, different families, different surface language. The same trapdoor in the same structural position, with slight variations that looked like customization but were actually calibration. Caldwell had adjusted the mechanism for each target, enough to obscure the similarity to a casual reader, not enough to obscure it to someone looking specifically for the pattern. "He's done this before," William said. "Not just here. This is too refined. He's been doing this in other counties, and he brought it here when he moved his operation. Which means there may be families we don't know about," Elizabeth said. "Further out. Which also means he has a lawyer who drafted all of this." "The same lawyer across all of them." Elizabeth stopped. She looked at him. "The lawyer's signature is on every document," she said slowly. "Is it?" She checked her family's contract. The Tanner agreement. The Greer document, same signature. "Samuel Parrish," she said. "Out of Louisville. If Parrish drafted all of these with knowledge of the intent, he's liable too," Elizabeth said. "Not just Caldwell. Parrish would lose his standing. He'd lose everything." She stared at the signature. "Caldwell's been using the same lawyer for all of it because he needed someone he could trust. Someone who was already in deep enough that they couldn't walk away. Which means Parrish is a vulnerability," William said. "A man that deep in might decide that cooperating with an investigation is better than going down with Caldwell." The look they exchanged across the table was not quite hope. It was something more useful than hope. It was strategy. The alderman piece came apart differently than either of them expected. They'd assumed Henry Alderman would be reluctant. He was a careful man. The kind who measured twice and cut once and didn't like disruption. But when Elizabeth went to speak with his wife Marta on Thursday, she walked into a situation that was already breaking open. Marta Alderman met her on the porch with red eyes and a letter in her hand. "He wrote to Henry," Marta said without preamble. "Caldwell wrote to him yesterday. He says the mill property arrangement needs to be, he calls it revisited. He says there are new considerations." She thrust the letter at Elizabeth. "He says Henry should come to Harlan next week to discuss terms." Elizabeth read the letter. It was smooth, friendly, completely opaque in its actual meaning unless you knew what to look for. "He's moving," Elizabeth said. "What does that mean?" "It means he knows we're talking to people." She looked at Marta. "Someone told him. Someone in the county who's been watching." She rode back to the farm faster than she'd ridden in the morning. And William was in the barn when she came in, and she told him about the letter. "His Rourke," he said. "What?" "Daniel said to watch for a man with a red beard." "Caldwell's man." He looked at her steadily. "I've seen him twice in the last week. At the North Road crossing, then again outside the trading post. I thought he was just watching. He's been reporting." "He knows we have the documents," Elizabeth said. "He doesn't know what we're going to do with them. He knows enough to make Caldwell nervous." She pressed her hand against her sternum, thinking fast. "If Caldwell moves on the aldermans before we're ready, then we move first," William said. "We go to Lexington. We take what we have to a lawyer there, not Parrish's people. Someone clean, and we file before the end of the week. We're not ready. We have enough to open a case." He stepped toward her, and his voice was low and certain. "Elizabeth, if we wait until we have everything, he'll dismantle everything. A man like Caldwell doesn't leave evidence in place once he knows someone's looking." She stood there for a moment. And she knew he was right. And she also knew that going to Lexington with what they had was a gamble, not a bad gamble, but a real one. "All right," she said. "When? Day after tomorrow. I know a man in Lexington, Frederick Cole. He went up against a fraudulent land claim in Fayette County 3 years ago and won. He's not afraid of money. Does he know who Caldwell is? He will by the time I'm done explaining." They left before dawn on Saturday. Margaret had packed food for the road and said nothing except, "You two be careful," in a tone that covered considerably more than the words did. William drove the wagon. Elizabeth sat beside him with the documents in a locked box on her lap and didn't speak much for the first hour because she was running arguments in her head how to present the pattern, what to lead with, what to hold back, and William seemed to understand this because he didn't push conversation. It was a long ride. The roads were still carrying the end of winter mud, and they stopped once to rest the horses, and they were somewhere in the middle stretch of the road when Elizabeth said, "Without planning to, my mother used to say that the worst thing you could do to a proud man was beat him at his own game." William glanced at her. "Your mother sounds like she was a smart woman. She died when I was 12, a beat. She was the one who taught me to read contracts. She said a woman who couldn't read the paper she was signing was a woman at the mercy of whoever handed it to her." Elizabeth looked at the road ahead. She would have found Caldwell's documents in 10 minutes. She would have found them faster than you did. Yes. A small pause. She would have found them, and then she would have found a way to use them. She was practical like that, not angry. "You're both," William said. She looked at him. "Practical and angry," he said. "The practical part comes out first. The angry part makes sure the practical part doesn't quit." She was quiet for a moment. "Is that a criticism?" "No," he said simply. "It's the most effective combination I've encountered." She turned her face forward again. The road unrolled ahead of them. The horses moved steady and quiet. And Elizabeth sat with that the most effective combination I've encountered, and felt something warm and uncomfortable move through her chest that she did not entirely know what to do with. Frederick Cole had an office above a printer's shop on the east side of Lexington. And he was a thin, unhurried man in his 50s with reading spectacles, and the particular quality of attention that meant he was absorbing everything and cataloging it as it came. He read all 3 documents without speaking. Then he read them again. Then he set them in a careful row on his desk and looked at Elizabeth and William over his spectacles. "You know who Samuel Parrish is," he said. "Caldwell's lawyer," William said. "Drafted all 3. Parrish is a member of the Louisville Bar in good standing. He has connections to 2 circuit court judges." Cole tapped the documents. "Whoever you've been talking to in this county, they've been talking back to Caldwell. And Caldwell's already been talking to Parrish. I'd bet my practice on it. We think he's going to move on the Alderman property this week," Elizabeth said. "Try to lock them in before we can act. He can try. If we file an injunction today and I can draft one this afternoon, the Alderman deal gets frozen until the fraud case is heard." Cole looked at them both. "This is survivable, what you have here. It's not a guarantee. Parrish will fight it, Caldwell will fight it, and they have more resources than you do. But the pattern in these documents is real, and a judge who isn't already in Caldwell's pocket will see it." "And if the judge is in his pocket?" William asked. "Then we find out which judge he's in and we request a change of venue." Cole picked up his pen. "I've been waiting for someone to bring me a Caldwell case for 6 years. He's been operating across 4 counties and nobody's had the documentation to do anything." He looked at Elizabeth. "Where did you learn to read a contract like this?" "My mother," she said. "Your mother saved your whole county considerable grief." He dipped his pen. "Tell me everything. From the beginning." They rode back in the late afternoon with a filed injunction and a case number, and the particular exhausted lightness that comes after you've thrown the stone and can't take it back. Elizabeth didn't speak until they were well clear of Lexington. Then she said, "He's going to know by Monday. Probably Sunday," William said. "Caldwell has people everywhere. He's going to be angry. Yes, not just bothered. Genuinely angry." She gripped the document box in her lap. "What does Caldwell do when he's genuinely angry?" William was quiet for a moment. "I don't know. I've never managed to genuinely threaten him before." She absorbed that. "That's not reassuring." "It's not." The wagon moved. The road darkened around them as the sun went down. They were 2 hours from home when the trouble found them. It came in the form of a rider blocking the road, one rider. Big man. In the last light, Elizabeth couldn't see his face, but she could see the breadth of his shoulders and the way he sat his horse, like a man who was accustomed to being an obstacle. William pulled the team to a stop. The man walked his horse forward slowly and stopped 10 feet from the wagon. "Red beard, Rourke, Mr. Carter," Rourke said. His voice was flat and without inflection. The voice of a man delivering a message he's been paid to deliver and has no personal investment in. "Mr. Caldwell sends his regards." "I'm sure he does," William said. "He asks that you consider carefully what you've set in motion today." Rourke's eyes moved to Elizabeth. Stayed there for a moment. Moved back to William. "He says that some situations can still be resolved quietly. Without courts. Without the kind of trouble that tends to fall on everyone in a dispute. Not just the people who started it. Tell Caldwell Elizabeth started." "Ma'am," Rourke said, and the word was not polite. "Mr. Caldwell isn't speaking to you." The air went very still. William's voice, when it came, was quiet and extremely precise. "Don't do that again." Rourke looked at him. "Don't speak to her that way again," William said. Same precision. The absolute absence of heat, which was somehow more dangerous than heat. "Not on my road." "Not anywhere I can hear it." A long moment, Rourke shifted in his saddle just slightly. Just enough to signal that the calculation had been made, and the conclusion reached. "Mr. Caldwell's offer stands until Monday," he said. "After that, the matter proceeds as it proceeds." "It's already proceeding," William said. "Tell him that." Rourke looked at them both one more time, then turned his horse and rode south, and the sound of hoofbeats faded into the dark. And Elizabeth let out a breath she'd been holding for what felt like a very long time. "He was watching us," she said. "He followed us to Lexington, or he was waiting on the road back. Knew there was only one main route." William got the team moving again. His jaw was tight. He wanted us to know he'd been watching. "That's the message more than anything," Caldwell said. "Intimidation, yes. It means he's scared," Elizabeth said. William glanced at her. "Confident men don't send people to stand in roads," she said. "They wait, they plan. They let the trap close." She looked back over her shoulder at the empty road behind them. "He sent Rourke because something we did today scared him." William was quiet for a moment. "The Parrish connection," he said slowly. "Colsett's Parish would fight the case. But we never said Parrish's name out loud to anyone except Cole." He paused. "If Caldwell sent Rourke out today, he knew we were going to Lexington before we got there. And he'd want to know what we found, what we told Cole. The only way he could know what we told Cole." "Parrish already knows," Elizabeth said. Cole was right. Caldwell had already talked to Parrish before we arrived. And when the injunction was filed, Parrish recognized the pattern immediately. He knew what it meant. She turned to face William fully. "Parrish told Caldwell this afternoon. That's why Rourke was on the road. Which means Parrish is going to do everything he can to discredit the documents before the case is heard. He can't discredit them. They're real. He can claim altered dates. He can claim the families misunderstood the arrangements and signed under no duress. He can try," Elizabeth said, "but he drafted them. Every line. If he attacks the documents in court, he's admitting he was there. That's not a defense. That's a confession dressed up as one." William looked at her. "You've thought about this more than you've let on," he said. "I've been thinking about this since the second day I was in your house," she said. "Since I found the first discrepancy in your ledger and understood it wasn't really about grain prices." The wagon moved through the dark. Steady and careful, the horses knowing the road better than any human navigating by feel. "Elizabeth," William said. She looked at him. When this is over, he stopped. "Started differently. I want you to know that what you've done, what you've put together, what you saw in those documents, none of this happens without you. Whatever comes next, that's true." She was quiet for a moment. The night was very still around them, and the cold was coming back in with the dark, and she could feel the weight of the document box on her lap, and the weight of what they'd started today, and the weight of his words, which were plain and direct and cost him something to say. "My mother would have liked you," she said. He didn't say anything. But she heard in his silence, that it landed where she'd meant it to. They got home past 9. Margaret had kept supper warm and asked no questions and went to bed. They ate at the kitchen table, in the particular silence of two people who have been through something together and don't need to narrate it. When Elizabeth finally pushed back from the table to go to bed, she stopped in the doorway. "William," he looked up. "Monday," she said. "When Caldwell decides the offer's off the table, what do you think he does?" William was quiet for a moment. "He comes himself," he said, "not Rourke himself. He'll want to look us in the face." She nodded slowly. "Then we'd better be ready." She took her lamp and went upstairs. And William sat alone in the kitchen, and he thought about Nathaniel Caldwell riding up to his front door after 15 years. And he thought about all the ways he'd imagined, that moment over the years, the fury of it, the satisfaction, and he found sitting there in the quiet kitchen, with Elizabeth's cup still on the table, and the documents filed in Lexington, and a case number that couldn't be unfiled, that what he felt now was not fury at all. It was something colder and more deliberate and considerably more dangerous. He blew out the lamp. Sunday came and went. Monday morning arrived like a held breath. And at 10:30, William heard hoofbeats on the road from Harlan. And he walked to the window, and he saw a gray thoroughbred that had cost $300 and a man on its back, who had cost this county considerably more. Nathaniel Caldwell had come himself. William didn't move from the window right away. He watched Caldwell ride up the front path at the kind of pace that announced itself not hurrying, not slow, the particular speed of a man who had decided exactly how this was going to go and wanted everyone watching to understand that before he ever opened his mouth. The gray thoroughbred was as impressive as Daniel had said. Caldwell had always understood the value of the entrance. William heard Elizabeth's footsteps on the stairs behind him. She'd heard the horse too. She came to stand beside him at the window. She looked out. She was very still for a moment, and then she said, "Quietly, he's alone, no Rourke," William said. "He thinks he doesn't need him." She paused. "That means he thinks this is already over." William turned from the window. Let him think that. He went to the door and opened it before Caldwell had finished dismounting. And he stood in the frame with his arms at his sides and watched Nathaniel Caldwell walk up the porch steps for the first time in 15 years. Caldwell was 43 now. He'd aged well in the way that men with money and no conscience tended to age well, the face still handsome in a broad, confident way, the gray at his temples worn like an accessory rather than an admission. He stopped at the top of the steps and looked at William with an expression that was almost friendly. "William," he said. "It's been a long time." "It has," William said. He did not move out of the doorway. Caldwell waited a beat, waiting to be invited in. When the invitation didn't come, something flickered behind his eyes. Not anger. "I think we should talk," Caldwell said. Man to man, privately. His eyes moved briefly past William into the hallway. "Whatever you have to say," William said, "you can say it here." Another flicker. "I'd rather not conduct business on a porch. Then I'd rather not conduct it at all. You've got about 2 minutes before I close this door. Say what you came to say." Caldwell looked at him for a long moment. Then he shifted a small movement, a resettling, and when he spoke again the friendly tone was still there, but it had a different quality underneath it now. Like a glove over something harder. "The injunction you filed is a nuisance," Caldwell said. "Not a threat. My lawyers will have it dismissed inside of 2 weeks. And when they do, the families you convinced to sign those statements are going to be in a considerably more difficult position than they're in now. You understand that?" "I understand that's what you want them to believe," William said. "It's not a matter of belief, it's a matter of how courts work. You have documents, I have lawyers. I've been down this road before." "I know," William said. "Fayette County, Anderson Township, 3 families over the line in Tennessee." He watched Caldwell's expression move. "That's right. Cole found them. Took him about a day once we knew what to look for." The friendly quality in Caldwell's face went somewhere else for a moment. It came back, but it took a half-second longer than it should have. And William noted that half-second the way you note the first crack in river ice. William. Caldwell's voice dropped into something more personal. More reasonable. I understand you have grievances. Your father's situation that was unfortunate. Genuinely. The investment failed and I'm sorry for what that meant to your family. You're not sorry. I am. I want you to know. Nathan. William kept his voice level. I've spent 15 years being angry at you. I know exactly what you are. I'm not interested in what you want me to know. I'm interested in what a circuit court judge is going to find in your documentation across 5 families and 2 states. And so is Frederick Cole, the name landed. Caldwell's jaw tightened just slightly. Just for a second. Cole is a small-town lawyer with a grudge. Cole has a case number, a signed injunction, and 3 more families who've agreed to testify. Elizabeth's voice came from behind William. He hadn't heard her move. She was there now, standing just behind his shoulder. And she stepped forward slightly, so she was visible in the doorway. And she looked at Nathaniel Caldwell with an expression that was entirely composed and completely without fear. Caldwell looked at her. Something moved across his face that William didn't like, not anger. Not recalculation, but something older and more personal. The look of a man confronting something he thought he'd put behind him that has declined to stay there. Elizabeth, he said. His voice was different now. Softer. I've been wanting to speak to you. I imagine you have, she said. What happened at the church was a choice you made in front of 40 witnesses, she said. I've made my peace with it. What I haven't made peace with is the clause in my father's contract that you drafted, knowing my father had a secondary creditor that you'd identified before you ever proposed the arrangement. She tilted her head slightly. That's not a romantic grievance, that's fraud. Caldwell was quiet for a moment. You were always intelligent, he said, and it came out with a kind of rueful quality. Like a compliment that cost him something. I knew that from the beginning. I always found it appealing, and yet you handed me a contract designed to strip my family's property and walked away from our wedding when the mechanism you'd built in became inconvenient. She held his gaze. Save the charm, Nathaniel. I know what it's for. The porch was very quiet. Then Caldwell did something William hadn't expected. He smiled, not the broad, confident smile of the entrance, something smaller and more real. And in some ways more unsettling because it reached his eyes. You've built something here, he said, looking between them. The 2 of you, I can see it, and I want you to understand I respect it. He paused. Which is why I'm here in person, without Rourke, without lawyers. Because I think we can resolve this in a way that works for everyone. What are you offering? William asked. The fort on your east acreage, Caldwell said, returned. Clean deed, no encumbrances. In exchange for withdrawing the injunction and closing the Cole case, William went very still. The Ford, 15 years. His father's face. And the other families, Elizabeth asked. Their arrangements stand as written. They signed. That's not negotiable. So you give William what his father lost, Elizabeth said slowly. And everyone else stays under your thumb, and you walk away with the scheme intact, just -1 property. I walk away from a legal action that would be costly and disruptive for everyone. Costly for you, she said. Not for us. Not anymore. Caldwell looked at her. Then at William. He was reading them. William realized, trying to find the crack. The point of pressure, the thing that would move. William, Caldwell said. Your father wanted that land back. You've wanted it back since you were 20 years old. I'm putting it on the table. The hook was real. William felt at the pull of it. The weight of 15 years of wanting. His father's shame. The east acreage that should have passed from father to son. And then he heard, in his own memory, Elizabeth's voice from a week ago. A bothered Caldwell is a dangerous one, at least when he's reacting. He's not planning. Caldwell wasn't reacting anymore. This was, William said. Caldwell blinked. No, William said again. Same voice, same steadiness. I don't want the Ford back on those terms. I want it back because a court found that you took it through fraud. There's a difference. The difference, Caldwell said. And the smooth quality was thinning now, is that a court finding takes 2 years and costs you everything you've built here while it runs. Maybe, William said. But here's what you don't want to hear, Nathaniel. Cole found 2 of the Tennessee families. One of them has a son who's a printer in Nashville. He's been sitting on this story for 3 years, waiting for someone to give him documentation he could stand behind. He paused. He's got it now. The color in Caldwell's face shifted. You print this in Nashville, William continued, and Lexington picks it up. Lexington prints it, and Louisville follows. And suddenly you're not a powerful man with expensive lawyers navigating a local dispute. You're a story. And stories about men like you travel faster than lawyers. Caldwell stood very still. You should leave, Elizabeth said, quietly, completely without malice. The way you say something that is simply true. You came to make an offer. We've declined it. There's nothing left to do here. Another long moment. Then Caldwell stepped back, once, and then he looked at William. And the thing in his face now was nothing William had ever seen there before, in 15 years of knowing him by reputation and memory and hatred. It was the look of a man who has just understood that he miscalculated. Not the situation himself, what he thought he was capable of, what he thought he could manage, what he thought he understood about the people standing in front of him. He went down the porch steps without another word. He mounted the thoroughbred. He rode south. William and Elizabeth stood in the doorway and watched him go. And neither of them said anything until the sound of hoofbeats had completely faded. Then Margaret's voice came from inside the house, dry and unhurried. Coffee's on. Elizabeth made a sound that was half and entirely real, and William felt something unknot in his chest that had been wound tight since Monday morning. And they went inside. The Nashville story ran on a Thursday. Cole sent a copy by express rider, and it arrived at the Carter farm on Saturday morning. And William read it at the kitchen table, while Elizabeth stood behind him, reading over his shoulder. And Margaret pretended to be focused on breakfast, while clearly reading it too. The printer's name was James Howell, and he had his mother's documents and 2 neighbors' accounts and a clear, unflinching way of laying out what Caldwell had done that managed to be completely factual and completely devastating at the same time. The headline used the word scheme. The second paragraph used the word fraud. He held this for 3 years, Elizabeth said softly. Waiting for someone else to move first, William said. So he wasn't alone. She was quiet for a moment. We gave him that. You gave him that. You saw the pattern first. She didn't argue. She straightened up and walked to the window, and William watched her. And she was thinking hard. He could see it in the set of her shoulders. The particular quality of her stillness. Caldwell's going to move his assets, she said. When he sees this, his first instinct is going to be to move whatever he can out of reach before Cole can get it frozen. Cole anticipated that. He filed for a broader injunction Friday. William set the paper down. It covers the Ford property, the mill arrangement with the aldermans, and the creek route through your father's land. She turned from the window. The creek route is my father's. It's not ours to.
It's in your father's name.
Which means if Caldwell tries to execute the transfer clause in your father's contract before the case is heard, the injunction stops it. He paused. Your father gets to keep the land. Whatever else happens. She looked at him for a long moment. You asked Cole to include that, she said, last week. Before we went. She didn't say anything right away. She looked at him with an expression that was complicated and open and considerably less guarded than anything he'd seen from her in the 6 weeks she'd been in his house. And then she looked away because the look had gotten away from her slightly, and she was reining it back in. Thank you, she said. Precise, but real. Your mother would have done the same, he said. She looked back at him then. Sharp and startled, and then something in her face settled into something softer. And she almost smiled, and this time it wasn't the infrastructure of a smile. It was the real thing, quiet and private, meant for him specifically. And it did something to the air in the kitchen that Margaret, pretending to tend the stove, definitely noticed. The next 3 weeks moved fast. Cole filed. Caldwell's lawyers fought. The Nashville story ran again in Lexington and got picked up in Louisville by the end of the second week. And by the middle of the third week, Samuel Parrish had retained separate counsel and stopped returning Caldwell's letters, which Cole reported with a satisfaction he didn't bother to conceal. A man who retained separate counsel was a man preparing to cooperate. The Greer family came to the Carter farm on a Tuesday evening, Jacob and Sarah both, and they sat at the kitchen table and they went over the case timeline with Elizabeth while William made coffee and listened. And at some point in the middle of it, Jacob Greer looked at Elizabeth and said, "I've been thinking about what you said. About beating him on paper, yes?" Elizabeth said. "My father lost land to a man like Caldwell when I was a boy. Different man, same type. I always thought the way you handled that was to be stronger or richer than him." Jacob turned his cup in his hands. "Turns out the way you handle it is to be smarter. And to find someone else who's smart and angry at the same time you are." He looked at William when he said the last part. And William said nothing, and Sarah Greer put her hand briefly over her husband's, and the kitchen was warm and full of the particular quality of people who had been through something together and come out the other side, still standing. After they left, Elizabeth cleared the cups and William banked the fire. And it was the most ordinary domestic sequence in the world, and also felt, in some way William couldn't quite name, like the most significant 20 minutes of his recent life. "Jacob's right," Elizabeth said, rinsing the cups at the basin. "About finding someone smart and angry at the same time. Is that what we are?" She looked at him over her shoulder. "Isn't it? I'm not angry anymore," he said, "not the way I was." She turned fully and looked at him. "When did that change?" He thought about it honestly. "Somewhere around the time you found the grain supplier discrepancy at 5 in the morning and told me my records were a disaster." She stared at him for a moment. Then she laughed, a real one, sudden and unguarded. The kind she didn't seem to have a lot of practice producing, but that, when it came, completely rearranged her face into something that made William's chest do something he wasn't prepared for. "That's a very strange thing to be moving," she said. "You're a very strange situation," he said. She stopped laughing, but the warmth of it stayed in her face. And they were standing 4 feet apart in the kitchen at the end of a long evening, and something had shifted in the room that both of them were aware of, and neither of them was ready to name. Elizabeth picked up her lamp. "Good night, William," she said. "Good night," he said. She went upstairs. He stood in the kitchen. He stood there for considerably longer than was strictly necessary. Parrish broke on a Wednesday. Cole sent word by Ryder Parrish had agreed to testify in exchange for a reduced censure rather than full disbarment. What he had to say was, in Cole's words, considerably more than we hoped for, and considerably worse than Caldwell knows. Parrish hadn't just drafted the fraudulent clauses. He'd done it knowingly, across 11 families in 4 counties, over a period of 8 years under Caldwell's direction. He had records. He'd kept records, Cole said, apparently because Parrish had known from the beginning that the day might come when the records were the only thing standing between him and complete ruin. And he'd kept them accordingly. 11 families. Elizabeth sat with that number for a long time. "We knew it was bigger than Harlan," William said. "Knowing and seeing it written down are different things," she said. Quietly, not upset, just absorbing 11 families. 8 years. And every single one of them thought they were the only one. "That's how it works," William said. "Isolation. Make each target feel like their situation is unique. Their failure is private. Nobody compares notes because everybody's ashamed." "We compared notes," she said. "You made us compare notes." He looked at her directly. "You're the one who saw the pattern. You're the one who went to Sarah Greer and the Tanners and put the documents side by side. You backed me," she said. "From the beginning. You didn't question it. I trusted your judgment." She looked at him for a moment with that expression that was complicated and open. And then she said, "Nobody's done that before." Trusted it that completely. Without conditions. "It's easy to trust judgment that's correct," he said. "My father trusted my judgment when it suited him," she said. "When it matched what he'd already decided, that's different." She paused. "You backed me when you didn't know if I was right. When it was still a risk." He didn't have an answer for that, that wasn't going to say too much. So he was quiet, and she let him be quiet, and they sat with it. The hearing date was set for April. March came in cold and went out warm, and in the space between, the Carter farm continued its ordinary life accounts and cattle and fencing, and the slow grinding business of making a piece of land produce, except that it wasn't quite the same ordinary life it had been in January. And both of them knew it, and neither of them talked about it directly. What they did instead was talk about everything else. They talked about the case, constantly and in detail. They talked about the farm Elizabeth had identified 2 more inefficiencies that, corrected, would add 8% to the annual return. And William had started actually listening when she explained things, rather than just nodding. They talked about her family her father had written twice. Was beginning to understand the scope of what Caldwell had done to him. Was somewhere between devastated and furious, which Elizabeth said was progress. They talked about William's father sometimes, briefly. In the oblique way, people talk about losses that are still too large to approach directly. What they didn't talk about was what was building between them. It was there. It was undeniable and building daily. In the way water builds behind a dam, patient, accumulative. Indifferent to whether you were ready for it. Margaret had stopped pretending not to notice. She'd moved to simply and cheerfully acknowledging it whenever the opportunity arose, which William found more irritating than any alternative, and which Elizabeth seemed to find silently amusing. The week before the hearing, Jacob Greer came by with news that Rourke had been seen leaving Harlan heading west, with 2 horses and a loaded pack. Caldwell's man. Leaving. He's cutting his losses, William said. Or Caldwell's already told him there won't be anything left to protect, Elizabeth said. Jacob looked between them, with the people had started wearing, when they looked between William and Elizabeth, a particular kind of settled certainty. Like looking at a thing that has already happened, and simply hasn't been officially acknowledged yet. "You 2 ought to get married," Jacob said. The kitchen went completely silent. "Jacob," Sarah said. "What?" "Everyone's thinking it." Elizabeth set down her cup very carefully. William looked at the table. Margaret at the stove. Made no sound whatsoever, which was loudest of all. "I think," Elizabeth said, with complete composure, "that we should focus on the hearing." "The hearing's in a week," Jacob said. "It takes 10 minutes to speak to a minister," Jacob, William said. "I'm just saying what everybody," Jacob. Firmer. Jacob subsided. Sarah gave him a look that promised a conversation later. The subject was dropped. They moved on to discussing the hearing logistics. Which witnesses Cole needed, what order he planned to present the documentation. But when the Greers left and Margaret went to bed and William and Elizabeth were alone in the kitchen again, the silence between them had a different texture than usual. The Jacob-shaped thing was sitting right in the middle of it, and neither of them was going to pretend it wasn't there. "He's not wrong," William said. He said it to the table. Not to her. Silence, about what people are thinking, he clarified. "He's not wrong about that." More silence, he looked up. Elizabeth was watching him with an expression he hadn't seen before. Not closed, not composed, not the controlled version of herself she'd shown the world since he'd pulled her out of the snow. Just watching. "Open." "William," she said carefully. "Are you asking me something?" He thought about it. "I'm telling you something," he said. "What you do with it is your choice." "It always has been." She was quiet for a moment, then. "What are you telling me?" "That you walked into my house with nothing, and you rebuilt something in it." "Not just the accounts, not just the case," he paused. "You rebuilt something in me that I thought was past rebuilding. And I'm not a man who says things like that easily. But I thought you should know it. Before the hearing. Before everything changes again. She looked at him for a long time. I came here, she said slowly, because I had nowhere else to go. I stayed because the work was real and you treated me like I was real. A pause. And then something happened that I wasn't expecting, and I haven't known what to do with it, because everything about my life for the last year has been about survival, and this is, she stopped. This is not survival. This is something else, he said. It scares me a little, honestly. Without apology. It scares me considerably, he said. She looked at him, and then she did something he hadn't expected. She reached across the table and put her hand over his. Just that. Just her hand over his, and she held it there. And she didn't say anything else, and neither did he. They stayed like that for a long moment in the warm kitchen at the end of a long March evening. And outside the last of the winter was finally giving way to something that felt like the beginning of a different season. And inside the dam had not quite broken, but was no longer pretending to hold. The night before the hearing, Elizabeth couldn't sleep. William heard her footsteps at 2 a.m. across the upstairs hall. Down the stairs, into the kitchen. He heard the sound of the kettle being moved to the stove. He lay in his own room for about 5 minutes and then he got up. She was at the table with tea she hadn't drunk yet when he came in. She looked up without surprise. "Sit down," she said. He sat. "I keep thinking about the 11 families," she said. The ones in other counties. Whether they know yet. Whether Parrish's testimony gets back to them in a way they can understand and use. "Cole's writing to 3 lawyers he knows across the affected counties," William said. "He's done it already, I know." She wrapped both hands around the cup. "I know all the practical things. I keep thinking about the feeling of it. The morning I went outside the church and the boy had taken the buggy away and there was no one there." She paused. Every one of those 11 families had a moment like that. When they realized. When they understood what had been done. "Yes," he said. "Nobody should have that moment and have it stay private," she said. That's what Caldwell counted on. The privacy of it. The shame. After tomorrow, William said, it won't be private anymore. No, she looked at her tea. After tomorrow, a lot of things won't be the same. That's not a bad thing. No. She looked up at him. It's not. He reached across the table. He put his hand over hers. The same way she'd done it the week before, returning the gesture. Simple and direct and full of everything he didn't have better words for. She turned her hand over under his. They sat like that until the kettle was warm. And she drank her tea, and they talked about some things, the north fence that needed mending again. The possibility of adding a second milk cow, whether Soldier's leg was fully healed and the hearing was tomorrow and everything was about to change, and neither of them was afraid anymore. That was the thing, William thought later, lying awake in the blue hour before dawn. Not that the fear was gone, the hearing was real. Caldwell was real, the risk was real, but underneath the fear was something solid that hadn't been there before. Something that held. He thought about his father in the East Acreage and the shame that had eaten that man's last years. And he thought about Elizabeth in the snow outside the church. And he thought about what she'd said. Every one of those families had a moment when they understood what had been done. And then they built something anyway. That was the part Caldwell hadn't calculated for. Not the case, not the documents, not Frederick Cole or James Howell's printing press. He hadn't calculated for what people did after the worst thing happened to them. He'd only ever seen the falling. He hadn't seen this part. William closed his eyes, and the morning came, and the day of the hearing arrived bright and cold and clear. And he and Elizabeth Carter rode toward Harlan, together with the documents and the case, and 15 years of waiting. And neither of them looked back. The courthouse in Harlan was a plain building with a plain bench and a judge named Harlan Dodd who had been on the circuit for 22 years and had the particular quality of attention that came from 2 decades of listening to men lie to him under oath. He was not impressive looking. He was not meant to be. He was the kind of man who let other men underestimate him, and then used that underestimation like a tool. Frederick Cole had told them this on the ride in. Don't mistake the quiet for weakness, he'd said. Dodd doesn't miss anything. Don't perform for him. Just tell the truth and let the documents do the work. Elizabeth had nodded. William had nodded. They'd both been nodding at Cole's instructions for 3 weeks, and they believed them. And still, walking into that room and seeing Nathaniel Caldwell already seated at the opposite table with 2 lawyers flanking him like architecture, Elizabeth felt something cold move through her that had nothing to do with the April morning. Caldwell looked at her when she walked in. She looked back. She didn't look away first. She sat down beside Cole and put the document case on the table and opened it and began organizing papers. And she did not look at Caldwell again, not because she was afraid, because he had already taken enough of her attention for one lifetime, and she was not giving him any more of it for free. William sat on her left. His shoulder was an inch from hers. That inch mattered. Judge Dodd came in without ceremony, and the room stood and sat, and he looked out at it over his spectacles and said, "We're here on the matter of Carter and Associated Complainants versus Caldwell. Mr. Cole, you filed. You go first." Cole stood. He was unhurried and precise, and he laid the case out in the plain, sequential way that documents demanded, not dramatic, not emotional, just the facts arranged in the order that made their meaning inescapable. He put the 3 original contracts on the table. He walked through the buried clauses. He named the pattern. He named Samuel Parrish. At the mention of Parrish, Caldwell's left lawyer leaned in and said something to Caldwell in a voice too low to hear. Caldwell's face did not change. Then Cole said, "The complainants will call their first witness," and he looked at Elizabeth. She stood. She had prepared for this. She had prepared for this the way she prepared for everything, completely, and without sentiment, running the questions and the answers until they were automatic. But sitting in the witness chair and looking out at the room, at William's face, at Jacob and Sarah Greer 2 rows back, at Robert Tanner beside them, at the aldermans on the end, she felt something she hadn't anticipated. Not fear, not nerves, gratitude. Sudden and fierce and almost inconvenient. All these people in this room, all of them here. She pushed it down and answered Cole's first question. She was on the stand for 40 minutes. Cole walked her through her father's contract, the clause, the timeline, the moment at the church, the documentation work afterward. She answered everything directly. She did not editorialize. She did not cry. She was the clearest, most factual version of herself, and when Caldwell's lawyer stood to cross-examine her, she was ready. His name was Marsh, and he was smooth in the way expensive lawyers were smooth, the questions shaped to seem reasonable, while implying something else entirely. "Miss Whitmore," Marsh began, "you were engaged to Mr. Caldwell by arrangement with your father. Is that correct?" "It is. And the contract in question was between your father and Mr. Caldwell, not between you and Mr. Caldwell." "That's correct. So your direct knowledge of the contract's terms comes from reading it," she said. "I read every document my father signed for 6 years. I kept his accounts. I was present for 2 of the meetings between my father and Mr. Caldwell." She paused. "I also have a copy of the contract in my father's hand, which he made at my request before he signed, because I asked him to give me a day to review it." Marsh paused. "You asked your father to give you a day to review the contract," he repeated. "Yes. And in that review, did you identify the clause in question?" The room was very quiet. "No," she said. "I identified the surrounding language as protective of my father's interests. I did not identify the secondary creditor mechanism because I did not know there was a secondary creditor to find a mechanism for." She held Marsh's gaze. "Mr. Caldwell knew. He'd had a surveyor examine my father's accounts the previous year. That surveyor's report is item 9 in the document case, and it is dated 4 months before the contract was proposed." Marsh looked at his own table. "At Caldwell. "I have no further questions," he said. She returned to her seat. William did not say anything. He put his hand briefly on the document case on the table between them, and she put her hand next to his, and that was the whole of it. Parrish took the stand at 11 o'clock. He was a diminished man. That was the only word for it, not physically. He was still solid and upright, but there was a quality of diminishment in how he carried himself. The way a structure looks the same from outside, right up until the moment you notice the foundation has been compromised. He had cooperated. He had agreed to testify. He understood exactly what that cost him. And the cost was visible in every line of him. He answered Cole's questions without ornamentation. Yes, he had drafted all 11 contracts. Yes, the secondary creditor clause was intentional in every instance. Yes, Caldwell had provided him with financial intelligence on each family before the contract was proposed, including information obtained without the family's knowledge or consent. Yes, he had known the arrangements were designed to fail. Yes, he had done it anyway. The courtroom stayed very quiet through all of this. Not the quiet of shock, the quiet of people absorbing something they had suspected and are now watching confirmed. Jacob Greer's hands were flat on his knees. Sarah's were in her lap. Robert Tanner was looking at the floor. Then Cole asked the question that the room had been waiting for. "Mr. Parrish, to your knowledge, is this the full extent of the scheme? 11 families, 4 counties, 8 years? Parrish was quiet for a moment. "No," he said. The room moved. "How many families?" Cole asked. Another pause. "Across all jurisdictions where I have direct knowledge," Parrish said. 23. The number landed like a physical thing. 23 families. Elizabeth heard William exhale beside her. She heard Jacob Greer make a sound that was not quite a word. She heard the judge's gavel come down once, sharp, restoring order to a room that had not quite broken but had come close. 23 families, 8 years. 1 man and 1 lawyer in the same mechanism, refined and adjusted and deployed over and over, and every single family sitting alone with their shame thinking they were the only ones. Elizabeth pressed her hands flat on the table. 23. She had known it was bigger than Harlan. She had told William it was bigger. But knowing and hearing the number spoken under oath in a courthouse were different in the way all knowing and experiencing were different. And she sat with 23 and felt it settle into her understanding like a stone finding the bottom of still water. Caldwell did not testify. His lawyers had advised against it, which everyone in the room understood, and Judge Dodd noted for the record that the defendant had declined to offer testimony and that the court drew its own conclusions accordingly. Then he looked at the document case and the Parrish testimony and the stack of signed family statements, and he took his spectacles off and cleaned them in the particular slow way of a man who has already decided but is giving himself a moment to be certain. "Mr. Caldwell," the judge said. Caldwell stood. He was still composed. Elizabeth had to give him that whatever else he was. The man had extraordinary composure. He stood there like a man at a business meeting. Not a man watching 8 years of deliberate fraud laid out in a courthouse with 23 families worth of evidence behind it. "I've reviewed the documentation," Judge Dodd said. "I've heard the testimony, the pattern described by Mr. Cole and confirmed by Mr. Parrish is consistent across every contract in evidence. And the intent to deceive is, in my assessment, not reasonably disputable." He put his spectacles head back on. "I am entering a judgment of fraud on all counts as presented. The injunctions filed by Mr. Cole are hereby made permanent pending full legal remedy. All property transfers executed under these contracts are stayed. I am additionally referring this matter to the Louisville Bar regarding Mr. Parrish's conduct and to the circuit attorney in 3 counties regarding potential criminal charges." He looked at Caldwell directly. "Mr. Caldwell, I have been on this circuit for 22 years. I have seen a great deal. What you have done here is not the most dramatic crime I have adjudicated. But it is, in its quiet and deliberate and sustained assault on the financial security of ordinary families. Among the most contemptible. He paused. That is all I have to say on the matter. Court is adjourned. The gavel came down, the room exhaled. Elizabeth sat very still for one full second. Then William's hand covered hers on the table, not brief this time. Not the passing gesture of the last weeks, but completely and with intention, and she turned her hand over and held on. It's done, Cole said, gathering papers with the calm efficiency of a man who had expected this outcome and was already thinking about the next step. Or rather, this part is done. The criminal referral will take time. The property remedies will take time. But the court judgment is entered and it's not coming back from that. The other families, Elizabeth said. The ones outside this county. I've already sent letters. The judgment is public record as of today. Every lawyer in the 4 counties who has a client with a Caldwell arrangement is going to come looking for us in the next month. Cole looked at her steadily. You should prepare for that. What does that mean for us specifically? It means your consultation is going to be in demand, Cole said simply. You saw this pattern when no one else did. You documented it. You built the case. People are going to want to know how. She looked at him. Think about it, he said, and went to gather his hat. They walked out of the courthouse into April sunlight. And the Greers were behind them, and the Tanners and the Aldermans. And they stood on the steps for a moment, and Jacob said something that made Sarah laugh, and Robert Tanner shook William's hand with both of his. And it was ordinary and real and loud in the way that things are when relief finally has room to be itself. Caldwell came out a minute later with his lawyers, and he walked past them all to his horse, and he did not speak to anyone, and no one spoke to him. And that the silence of it, the way the crowd simply closed around his absence, was its own kind of verdict. Elizabeth watched him mount up. He looked at her once. From the saddle. Just once. Something passed across his face that she couldn't name and didn't try to. Then he rode south, the gray thoroughbred moving away down the Harlan Road. And she watched until she couldn't see him anymore, and then she turned away and did not watch again. William was beside her. All right, yes, she said. And she was. The ride home was slower than the ride in. Not because anything was wrong, because neither of them was in a hurry. And the day was warm for April, and there was a quality to the road and the light and the particular silence between two people who have just finished a very long and difficult thing together that was worth not rushing. They were about a mile from the farm when Elizabeth said, Cole thinks I should consult. I heard him help other families identify the same kind of documentation fraud. Walk through contracts with people who can't afford lawyers or don't know what to look for. She paused. He thinks there's real work in it. There is, William said. 23 families worth of real work, and then whatever comes after. It wouldn't be I couldn't do it from here, and also manage your accounts. Not both things fully. He was quiet for a moment. The horses moved. The road was soft with the last of the spring mud. I'm not going to tell you not to do it, he said. I know. She looked at the road. I'm not asking permission. I'm thinking out loud. Then think out loud. I could do both if I had help with the accounts. Someone to train. She paused. Or I could find another position in Harlan and do the consulting from there. Or, William said. Carefully, you could do the consulting from here. As my wife. Which would make the account situation considerably easier to organize and would also, incidentally, resolve the question of what the county thinks of our current arrangement. The word wife sat in the air between them. Elizabeth did not look at him for a long moment. That is, she said finally. The least romantic proposal I have ever heard. I told you in January I'm not a romantic man. You did. She was quiet. You also told me in March that I rebuilt something in you that you thought was past rebuilding. I did. That was romantic, she said. Considerably. He looked at her then, and she was already looking at him. And the almost smile was there, but it had fully arrived this time. Wide and unguarded and real, and he thought he had never in his life seen anything he wanted to keep looking at, more than this woman's face when she let herself be happy. Elizabeth, he said, Plain and direct, the way he said everything. "Will you stay?" She held his gaze. "Yes," she said. The same way. Plain and direct and without decoration. "Yes, William, I'll stay." He reached over and took her hand. And she let him, and they rode the last mile home like that. And the farm came up ahead of them in the afternoon light, and it looked like something that belonged to both of them. Which it now did, and the feeling of that was so large and so simple that neither of them tried to put it into words. Margaret met them at the door. She looked at their faces and then at their joined hands, and she pressed her lips together in a way that meant she was not going to cry. And then she said, "I'll put supper on," and went back inside. And the sound she made going down the hall might have been a sob, or might have been a laugh, and was probably both. They married on a Saturday in May. Not in the Harlan church. Neither of them wanted that particular building, and neither of them explained why. They married in the yard of the Carter farm, with Reverend Clement from the North Road congregation, who had known William's father, and said so at the beginning of the ceremony in a way that made it a blessing, rather than a reminder. The Greers came, the Tanners, the Aldermans. Frederick Cole rode out from Lexington, which nobody had asked him to do, and which seemed entirely in character. Margaret wore a dress Elizabeth had never seen before, and refused to explain where it had come from. Daniel Whitmore came. He rode up that morning alone. Their father was not well enough to travel, he said, and he stood in the yard with his hat in his hands, and when he saw Elizabeth, he looked so much like someone trying not to cry that she took pity on him and hugged him first. "He's proud of you," Daniel said quietly into her shoulder. "He told me to tell you. He said to tell you that Mother would have been proud of you too." She held on to her brother for a long moment and did not try to speak. The ceremony was short and plain and real. William said his words in the same voice. He said everything without performance, without self-consciousness, and she said hers in the same way. And when it was done, he took both her hands and looked at her and said, very quietly, just for her, "Thank you for staying." And she said, just as quietly, "Thank you for stopping." Both of them knew exactly what that meant. The consulting work began the following month. The first family came from a county east of Harlan, a widow named Mrs. Pratt, whose late husband had signed a land arrangement she didn't understand and couldn't afford a lawyer to explain. Elizabeth sat with her at the kitchen table for 2 hours and went through every page and found the mechanism on the fourth document and explained it in plain language and watched Mrs. Pratt's face moved from confusion to understanding to a particular cold fury that Elizabeth recognized because she had felt it herself. "What do I do?" Mrs. Pratt asked. "You write to Frederick Cole in Lexington," Elizabeth said. "You tell him I sent you. You take these 4 pages and you don't sign anything else until he's seen them, Mrs." Pratt left with the information and her dignity intact, which was more than she'd arrived with. William was at the door when Elizabeth came back inside. "How'd it go?" he asked. "She'll be all right," Elizabeth said. She came in thinking she'd done something foolish. She's leaving knowing she was deceived, which is different. She paused. She has 3 daughters. She was going to lose the farm. And now she has a fighting chance. Elizabeth hung up her coat. "Cole's going to have his hands full. Cole's going to be very happy about that." She looked at him. And the something that lived now permanently in her chest, when she looked at him warm and real and entirely her own, moved in the way it always did. "There are more families out there," she said. "I know it. More than even Parrish knew about. Men like Caldwell don't build one scheme. They build a method. You want to find them. I want to give them what Mrs. Pratt got today." She met his eyes, the chance to know they weren't foolish. They were targeted. "There's a difference." He looked at her for a moment. "We're going to need a bigger kitchen table." She laughed. That real one, sudden and unguarded, that still caught him every time. Caldwell's criminal case was heard in Louisville in the autumn. Cole wrote them with the outcome: 3 charges upheld. 1 dismissed, fines and civil penalties that were substantial even for a man of Caldwell's resources, and a permanent bar from entering into land or financial arrangements in 4 counties. His Lexington properties were liquidated to pay remedies. The thoroughbred was gone. The Ford on the Carter East acreage was returned by court order. William rode out to it on a Thursday morning alone, and he stood at the water's edge and looked at the ground that had been his father's and his grandfather's. And he felt something leave him that had been lodged in his chest for 15 years. Not anger, not grief. Something older and less named the weight of an injustice that has finally been answered. He didn't stay long. There was work to do. He rode back to the farm, and Elizabeth was at the kitchen table, with 2 new family's documents spread open in front of her and a look on her face that meant she'd found something she hadn't expected. And she looked up when he came in. "The Ford," she said. "Ours," he said. She held his gaze for a moment. "Your father would have," "Yeah," he said quietly. "He would have. Then, come look at this. I think this is the same clause from a different drafter." Which means Parrish wasn't the only lawyer Caldwell used. He pulled up a chair and sat beside her. Shoulder to shoulder now, their natural working position. And he looked at where she was pointing, and he said, "And show me." Years later, when people in Harlan County talked about Elizabeth Carter, and they did talk about her, in the particular way communities talk about people who changed something in the of how things worked, they mostly talked about the consulting work, the families she helped, the contracts she untangled, the women she sat with who came in ashamed and left understanding that shame was not theirs to carry. But the ones who knew her well talked about something else. They talked about a February morning when Sarah Greer had gone to the Carter farm and found Elizabeth at the barn at dawn, sitting on a hay bale talking to William's horse, and when Sarah asked what she was doing, Elizabeth had said entirely seriously, "Working through an argument I'm going to have with William about the North Pasture rotation." They talked about the fact that Elizabeth won that argument, and most of the subsequent ones, though William gave as good as he got, and both of them knew it. They talked about the school she started in the 3rd year of their marriage. Nothing formal at first. Just a room in the farmhouse, 2 mornings a week, where women who wanted to understand their household accounts could come and learn. Then it grew. Then it needed its own building, which William built with Jacob Greer's help over one long summer, and which Elizabeth named simply and without sentiment, the Whitmore Room, for her mother. And sometimes, when someone new to the county heard the story The Abandoned Bride in the Snow, the enemy who stopped, the fraud case that unraveled 8 years of one-man scheme, they would ask, inevitably, about Caldwell, whether she was glad he'd been brought to justice, whether it felt like revenge. Elizabeth's answer was always the same. "It felt like repair," she said. "Those are different things." The person asking would usually think about that for a moment. And William, they'd ask. He'd wanted revenge for 15 years. How did he feel? She'd look at whoever was asking with that direct, clear look that meant she was about to say something completely true. He got his father's land back, she said, and he got to watch something be built on it instead of just guarded. "I think that was better than revenge." A pause. "I think he'd tell you the same." And he would. Because the greatest thing William Carter had ever done was not filing the case or facing Caldwell on the porch or even getting back the Ford his father had lost. It was stopping his horse on a January ridge and climbing down into the snow and saying to a furious, frozen, entirely unknown woman, "I've got you," and meaning it for the rest of his life. That was the whole story, and it was enough.